Alrighty, so today we're going to be going over all the different columns and what they do. There's dozens of them, and I want to make sure that we understand what we're looking at when we're actually working with the boards and actually understand the full capabilities and functionalities of them. So this is going to be a pretty advanced, for lack of better words, tutorial of every single column and how we can start using them. This is going to be video 2 of 4. On video 3, we're actually going to go over like advanced workflows and automations that then utilize the functionalities within the actual columns themselves. I'll also go over like some of the other buttons, such as the AI features, and as well as the item card view and how we can customize that as well. So let's jump right into it. So first things first, we have the people column. So the people column is a way for you to actually assign people to a task. And that seems pretty straightforward. But why it matters is that we can actually have this people column serve as a dependency for both generating charts and generating automations. Meaning that when we want to see, for example, if you have a pipeline, how many deals were assigned to X person, we can go ahead and see that on a chronological view because we have this person parameter. But we can also use that to be a dynamic field, which is fancy for saying that when a new task is completed, we don't have to set an automation for every single task. We can actually make it task agnostic so that when status is completed, notify the person that's assigned to that task to get notified. So you don't have to say for task 1, I have to notify Danny. Then for task 2, I have to notify Danny. And then I have to notify Danny. And if instead we have all of these items assigned to Danny, and then we build only one automation and say, so when status changes to done, notify someone, in this case, we can dynamically select the people or person column there. The other thing is when you click into the 3 dots, you're going to notice a few things. There's all these settings, but the biggest one is inside the settings section that we can customize the people column. So we can actually select this and change this to see how many people can be assigned to this. What this means is that if we were to set it to 2, only a maximum of 2 people can be added. I can't select up to more people or else we'll get this issue. And so this can also allow us to make it easier to ensure who can get assigned to what and how many people can be assigned to this. But what's interesting about this is that we don't have to just assign people. We can also assign teams to this. So the way we can do that is if we invite a team into our board, in this case, I'll do electrical team. I can now assign electrical team as one of the assignees, which can have multiple people. And so that way you can assign either teams or individuals to tasks or projects. The next column is the status column. And the status column can have multiple purposes. The biggest thing about the status column is that it allows you to track different steps or stages, but it can also serve the purpose of a tagging system, meaning when status is done and only if it's this type of task, do this. So we can have 2 status columns, one that tells us the stage and one that tells us the type of task. So in this case, we can have working on it, stuck and done, and then type of task. And we can say when type of task is architecture, and let's say another one is electrical, we can then assign these tasks as such. And then we can say when status changes to done, and only if the status, in this case, type of task is architecture, then move the item to the purple group. So this allows us to have pathways and much more robust conditional logic to ensure that the right steps or the right automations are triggering the right process flows. So in this case, when this one changes to done versus this one changes to done, only one of the items will move to the purple group, which is in this case, the architecture one. And please keep in mind that the colors don't have to be this. This is just how it is out of the box, but you can change the colors to be whatever you want. Right, so if I move this back, change this back to done, you're going to notice it still triggers the exact same way. The other thing about this is when we click customize the status column, there's a little secret section called choose which colors indicate that an item is completed. So what this allows us to do is when we change this to green, we're determining what is considered a status or done color. And I'll get into this when we get into the more advanced section. But long story short, when you create graphs or when you're creating the My Work view, the My Work view has a special feature that allows you to hide anything that's done. And so we have to choose what is considered done for us. In this case, we can choose multiple colors or unselect them and specifically say for some reason working on it is done. And that'll then automatically have that filter run and hide anything that's considered done. The next one is the date column. So this date column is very interesting because we can customize how we want that date to be set up, and we can also synchronize it to our calendars. We can change the format, we can enable or disable weekends, we can show the time by default, an icon to show the date and show the week number. So when we open this up, we can see the time, the date, we can add an icon, etc. But what's neat to this, I'm going to add a column to the right, there's also something called a timeline. So very often I see people do the following, and they'll work, and it's almost like double work where you have the start date be the 31st and the end date be the 6th of August. But what's cool about a timeline column is that it's basically 2 date columns in one column. So now we can say the start date is July 31st and it ends on July or August 6th. And why this matters is that now we can have an official duration for the timeline associated to the task. So when we want to generate a Gantt chart or a timeline chart, we can actually see the task duration. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. Heading over to the dashboard, let's add a new widget, search up Gantt, and we can see all of these items have a bar associated to them, but they're not connected yet, and I'll get to that shortly. And we go into settings, it's because it's choosing timeline. So if we're to just select start and end date, this doesn't really give us much of any context. It just tells us when things are either starting or ending, and it looks pretty confusing. So by using the timeline, we can actually go ahead and start seeing a more realistic understanding of what the items are actually doing, or where the items are in the process, and if any of them will be running behind, which I'll get to after. So coming back into the timeline, we can then go ahead and click the settings and customize the timeline table, very similar to the date column that we showed. We can also set it as a deadline. So all this means is it automatically color codes this into letting you know if it's overdue or not. So we can choose a status column, and we can also choose if a person needs to be associated. So if I click connect columns, you now see that something is green, meaning that it's good, it was completed on time. Red, meaning that it's not done and it's overdue. And then purple means that it's on track or in progress, basically based on the color of the group title. And what's also cool is, do you notice that as I highlight the actual timeline column, there's 8 days and it tells me how many days are left until we reach the end date. We can actually now add another thing called connect with duration, and you see these 1, 2, 3 numbers. Well, that means I need to add something called a numbers column. This numbers column can do a lot of things, but one of the cool things we can actually do is we can connect it with duration, in this case numbers, and it's going to auto-populate the total length of the task itself. I'm going to call this duration first and foremost, and then I'm going to connect it. Now you're going to notice that right now nothing has populated. It's because the timelines already existed. So ideally what you'd want to do is set this up to begin with. So we're going to set the dates, and you're going to see the numbers auto-populate just like that. And now we have durations in days. This leads me to the numbers column. The numbers column, as the name implies, stores and only stores numbers. So you cannot put text. If I were to type in test, it's not going to let me. Only if I put in the number will it let me actually start typing something. What's cool about the numbers column is that this allows us to start putting a numeric value to whatever we want to do. So in this case, the duration of the task. So now we can ask a question like, what is the average duration of each task? So if I were to go to the dashboard, we can select the numbers column, in this case, numbers. And right now we have it set to sum. In this case, I want to select the average. In this case, it's average task length. And the reason I know this is if we go to settings, we can see selecting duration, and it's selecting the column. So we have duration set. And you can also see this bottom section here of a group. It's called the group summary. And it's basically culminating the result of certain columns, in this case, the timeline, the duration, the tasks. So we can see how many tasks are done, how many tasks are electrical versus something else, and the sum. We can also change this here to average, and then the total timeline here. Now, the other thing that we can do is we can also use another numbers column to help us understand another metric. Let's say cost. In this case, the cost is going to be $50, $75, $80, $90, and $120. But we want this to look a little bit better, and we want to format it so it's easier to associate it to a cost. So we click the 3 dots, we click settings, we can select customize number column, and we can automatically select a symbol, either in the left or the right section. But second to that, we can also put our own symbol. So we could also say, in this case, going towards the duration, we can type in days. And that way it's a little bit clearer and easier to see. Now keep in mind, this is still technically a number. It's not a text, so you can't go in and type in something else. This is just more like a little bit of Monday magic happening in the background. So it displays a text next to a number, but the column is still just a numerical value. But this leads us to the next thing. What if I wanted to see what is the average cost, or how much is it going to cost us per day per task? Well, we can add a new column called the formula column. And the formula column is essentially a very advanced calculator. And this calculator can do quite a bit. You'd be surprised. The first one, very simple, is I want to take 10 and divide it by 50. So what we would do is we would type in the name of the column, and how you can type in the name is by either selecting the column here and selecting the name, in this case, duration, cost divided by duration. And this will be cost per day. And what's cool is that we can take this, go back into the dashboard and ask the same question. What will be our average cost per day? $8.67, or $8.07, excuse me. Another thing we can do is we can set more advanced formulas to give us more context about a task. In this case, we can have something called a weighted formula. And a weighted formula basically says how important is something based on more than one condition. So for example, the task electrical is more important than the task architecture, and who's assigned to it is also more important than somebody else. So for example, Danny, the CEO, might be worth 2 points, but Sam, the CTO, is only worth 1 point. Sorry, Sam. And the task electrical is worth 3 points and architecture is worth 1 point. So let's go ahead and map that out as a formula. So I'm going to type in another formula. If the condition is Danny Esquivel, my name, we can do 1, else do 0. As a simple example, what we're getting is either a numeric value of 1 and 0, and then I want to sum this and then say if type of task is electrical, it's worth 3 points, or else it's worth 0. And in my case, I remember the example being 2 and 1, and then 3 and 1 as such. And this is an example of typing out a formula. Now, there is a better way to do this. It's called nesting if statements. We won't get into that. But I just wanted to show the art of the possible of what Monday can do. Moving along, we can also have another important column called dependency. And the dependency essentially allows us to create a relationship, for lack of better words, or as the name implies, dependencies between tasks. And there's 3 options. There's flexible, there's strict, and there's no action. No action means that when the date of task 1 supersedes task 2, the other subsequent tasks will not update their dates. Strict means that if task 1 changes its date either forward or backwards, the rest of the tasks will move back. And finally, flexible is that when the task moves, and as long as it doesn't supersede the second task, it will not change the subsequent tasks. So in this case, we'll leave it as flexible. So we can see that right now the dependency has been set, and I'm going to move the column over to the left, but nothing has happened. So we're going to go ahead and set the dates again. So I know that item 1, I'm going to move this here, and item 2 should be dependent to item 1. I'm going to set this dependent to item 1. Item 4 is dependent on item 3, and then item 5 is dependent on item 4. Great. Now I'm going to set the dates. 24th. This one might be the 23rd to the 31st. This is going to be 29th to the 5th, 6th to the 8th or 9th, and then maybe the 9th to the 14th. And now we have it all set up. Now, one way you can test this is by changing the dates. So the 16th to the 26th. So I change it back July 8th to the 24th, and you notice all the dates suddenly updated. We go over to the dashboard. We can see that all of these now have arrows. So as I move this back, in this case, because I made it strict, they're all set up. But do you notice how when I move the second one, the first one isn't being updated? It's because item 2 is dependent on item 1, but not the other way around. So when I move this date, it's only moving and adjusting the subsequent dates. Let me zoom out a little bit, in front of them, but not behind them, as you can see. But the moment I move the one on top, it shifts everything forward and backwards. And that's what the timeline column is essentially allowing us to do, combined with the dependency column. Now we can get to some of the other nice to have columns that, well, I wouldn't say nice to have, but just columns that a lot of people end up using. The text column, very simple. We can just use this as a notes section. We can type in whatever we want. And when you highlight over it, we can see that, or we can click the wrap section. So when we select this, it'll expand the text for us. So the more we type out and see that it's updating and expanding the actual row itself. Very much like an Excel sheet would do so. Another way we can also add a text is by adding something called a long text column. So when we add to board, this one will actually allow us to type and expand the column as such. So copying this into this, we can see it here, and we can see the information, especially as we type it out. We can again select wrap text so we can see it all normal. The next column is meeting notes, creative brief, and files. These are all technically the same column. So if I search up the word files, but they just come with a file that's already a template called a document. So I'll get to that in a second. So files allows us to upload anything from anywhere and also upload a document. So in this case, I'm going to upload a file from my computer. And then here I can click to create a new doc. So here's a picture. Very nice. And here's the document. So as I mentioned, that other columns, such as creative brief, when I click add to board, you're going to notice it's the exact same thing, but it's going to allow me to select a template instead. When I open it, it has this type of template instead for the Monday doc versus just being a blank slate. Now, on top of that, there's a few other really handy columns that I do want to go over. The first one is location. This one allows us to type in a location for us. So if I were to do Giza versus Colosseum versus Machu Picchu, and I go to the dashboard, I can actually visualize this as a map. And it allows us to see the different locations that we mapped. So as we zoom out, you can see Giza, the Colosseum, and Machu Picchu. The next one is a link column. So let's say you're sending out forms or you need to capture someone's website. We can actually type this in as an official URL. So www.google.com. And when you click into it, it'll take you to Google. That's an example. Next column is the checkbox. So what's interesting about the checkbox is that it just checks and unchecks things. This is almost like a simplified version of a status column because when you select the checkbox, and actually I'm going to select another one, a button, both of these do the same thing. One is just more visually appealing and normally has an automation to be set up. So in this case, I can click button setup. So when button is click, the same thing is like saying when status changes to something, take this action. Move an item to the group below. It's the same thing with the checkbox if you wanted to, but if I click this, it's going to go ahead and move this down. The next thing is the drop-down column. Now, the drop-down column is almost like a status column, but it allows you to select multiple items. So let's say in this case, it could be different types of departments. So what's neat about this is that we can select either one item at a time or select multiple items at the same time. We can change the settings so it's only a certain number of drop-downs so we can select. Now, when should we use stage versus drop-down? In my opinion, if you only use the status column all the time, it's going to look overly colorful versus the dropdown makes things a little bit cleaner and you can simply change it so that only one item can be selected at a time or maybe two items, right? Just do one. But there's another big caveat or important consideration is the limit of number of titles that you can create between each column. On the status column, there is a total of 40 statuses at the moment versus the drop-down column should be 500 at the moment. So what that means is if you have a bunch of different tags that you need to utilize, you probably shouldn't use a stage because you'll easily hit that limit versus a drop-down will make it a lot easier to be more flexible or modular in the way that you're tagging things. So for example, that type of task, maybe you have 30 or 50 or 100 different types of tasks per project template, and you need to tag each of them. That's where the drop-down column will come into play. And finally, there's a few other columns that are basically the same column. So for example, priority is just a status column, but just comes with a different template that's already pre-built for you. Same thing with the phone or email. It's like a fancy column that just has specific formatting enabled. So in this case, if I were to select phone or email, I have to type it in the exact format or it's not going to work. Same thing for phone. I need to put in a legitimate phone or it's not going to work. And finally, there's a few other nice to haves depending on what you're trying to accomplish. For example, a common one is time tracking. I know this is a very common ask, so I'm going to go ahead and grab this and move it to the left-hand side. So anyone can go ahead and start tracking their time, or they can manually select a session of time spent on a task. What's also neat is that we can automate this. So when status changes to working on it, time tracking starts, we can do start time tracking versus when status changes to done, stop time tracking. So we can see this in action, working on it, and it's starting to track the time versus done, and the time tracking stops. Other neat thing about this when we go to the settings is when we click customize, we can remove the seconds if we wanted to. So it's all in minutes. And we can also export all this data into Excel sheets. So if you have multiple people, as you can tell, it's like Danny Esquivel. But if you had another user come in, you would see that other user's name and time tracked, and you would be able to export all of this. And this is what it would look like. Item 1 and the time tracking done. So I'm going to show you with multiple items. So item 1 and item 3 and who did what. So you'd be able to generate really advanced and more robust reports on your team members' time tracking sessions. So there's that. We have all this information, and I don't know if you're noticing, but doesn't it almost feel overwhelming when you have to see everything left to right? It almost feels like you can't see everything at the same time. So that's where we get this nifty button, which we kind of talked about right in new update. And it takes you to the same spot whenever I click open. So what can we do with this? This is the item card view where we can see our files, we can see the activity log. But there's something else we can do if we notice that there's this plus view, which is called add a view. And there's a few things that we can start doing in here. The first one is the item card. What this is essentially going to do is put the columns in a form format. And so what's cool is that we can start creating custom views of information that we want to see. In this case, I'm going to unselect everything. I want to see the person, stage, time tracking, and timeline. I'm going to add something called a text column that allows me to see the specific columns of text that we were adding notes in, kind of like this. I then want to see the duration, cost per day. I'm going to go ahead and expand this for the sake of being consistent, or actually decrease this. Then the other thing that we can do is we can click add a widget and select the files gallery, right? So we can also see any files that we have uploaded if we wanted to. And we can reorganize this, right? Like you can get completely creative on how you want to do this or what makes sense for your team. There you go, as such. So as you can tell, instead of having to scroll left to right, we can see everything in here. Also, another thing that I forgot to add is sub-items. Right, I do sub-item test 1 or test 2, I guess. And this one's going to be test 3, test 4. Maybe you don't want to see all the information from the sub-items by having to open them up. So instead, we can just add another widget called sub-items and pull up the information for test 2 as such. And again, all of this can be customized. We can also add a new sub-item if we wanted to. We can also group by, which is a feature we can talk about after. I can see the group name if I wanted to, the board that it's part of. In this case, it doesn't really help. Same thing with item 3. It now pulls up the different things. We can group by the statuses of the sub-items. So if I were to group by status, it will tell me what sub-items are doing what. And this is how we can start creating these custom UIs for our team members to have an easier time to actually execute and do their work on a day-to-day basis. So hopefully this all made sense for the columns. In the next video, I'm actually going to go ahead and jump into the more AI column features, because a lot of these columns have a function where you can actually use AI to automatically fill out the data for you. So we can go ahead and kind of jump into what AI does, how it's functioning within Monday, and how you can start building out a more advanced and robust workflow for you and your team while also utilizing AI to supercharge your team. So hope this helps, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.